Good afternoon. We are here with John Neuffer. He is the president and CEO of the Semiconductor Industry Association of the United States. John, you're based right down in Washington, D.C., and thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Shelby. Actually, I'm sitting in my home in Virginia. Like you said, we're based here in Washington, and before COVID-19, we spent a lot of time in planes flying out to the various states where semiconductors are manufactured. There's 18 of them, not just California, but it's Colorado, Florida, New York.
New York.
About 83% of our sales are overseas. So what the foreign governments do in terms of policy and regulation are very important to us. So we spend a lot of time with these governments to try to ensure they don't do something that impedes our ability to do business around the world. SIA represents 95% of US headquartered semiconductor companies. Mm-hmm. All the big names like Global Foundries, Qualcomm, Intel, Micron, Texas Instruments, and many more. But we're not just a US industry, we're a global industry. And we also have some international members, such as Samsung and Infineon. And I'd say in terms of our big ticket policy issues we look at of trade, as I mentioned, more than 80% of our sales go overseas. So trade policy is very important to us. China policy, very important to us. China is our biggest and fastest growing market, accounting for about 35% of our annual sales every year. And then the export of sensitive technologies overseas, that's come into bold relief lately. And some semiconductors are sensitive technologies. And then finally, an area that we spend a lot of time on, but frankly, we're not getting a lot of progress on is workforce issues, especially the ones related to immigration. We do a great job in the US of training foreign talent because frankly, we don't have enough indigenous electrical engineers, but we do a great job in training foreign talent, but our immigration system is set up so that we chase the foreign talent back home to work for competitors. Shelby, I'm really glad you asked to have this conversation because right now semiconductors are very much at the center of policy discussions in Washington and capitals around the world. Semiconductors power everything digital in our economy. Every device with electric current probably involves a semiconductor, including toasters, not just cell phones, but refrigerators, AI, quantum computing, 5G, and after 5G, there will be 6G. That's all powered by semiconductors. So that's kind of on our daily lives, how important semiconductors are. But for national defense, they're all powered at their core by semiconductors. There's a lot of attention on our industry right now. Mm-hmm. And we'll talk in a little bit about that. A lot of activity happening in Washington along these lines.
Well, can you tell me a little bit about the history? I've been involved with the semiconductor industry since roughly 2000 with our region and states initiative to mm-hmm. try to attract that to upstate New York. And, we had a significant presence with IBM, but we wanted to attract the next generation of manufacturing and technology because we know how important it is to our gross domestic product. The US, what is our position now compared to where it was even in 2000?
Yeah, great question. So semiconductors were invented here in the US over a century ago. And with very strong, except for a very strong challenge by the Japanese in the 80s, we have been the dominant force globally. Right now, we control roughly 50% of global market share, and it's been that way for decades. One of the things that we're really struggling with in industry is that while we are very strong in terms of semiconductor technologies and semiconductor design, when it comes to manufacturing, that's where there's been some slippage. So in 1990, we manufactured in the US about 40% of all the semiconductors in the world. Now we manufacture about 12%. So it's gone from 37% to 12%. Now, that's not because our manufacturing has decreased here in the US. As a matter of fact, it's increased at a reasonable clip. But what's happened is semiconductor manufacturing around the world has exploded. And most of it is now done in Asia. About 3/4 of it is done in Asia. Other places, Europe is a major semiconductor manufacturer, Israel. So others have kind of filled the demand and not so much us. And it's important to understand, Shelby, that the semiconductor industry is kind of broken into three different business models. One are companies that just manufacture, and that's like global foundries, and they just manufacture the chips. Others, and then there's others that just design chips. So there's the design guys, the foundry guys, and then there's the guys that do both, like Intel. Yeah. And it's the what's happened is a lot of the companies that design chips are having them manufactured here, but they're also having them manufactured overseas. And that's where we've slipped, is in our ability to manufacture chips here in the US. You know, one of the, in terms of manufacturing, the competitive advantage is that right now, when a company is looking to cite manufacturing facility, semiconductor manufacturing facility, which is called a fabrication facility. They're looking around the world, and what we have now, or we have states in the US providing incentives, tax, infrastructure, other kinds of incentives, competing against national governments, which have huge coffers. And we don't have a federal program in place to do that. So it's really very much not a level playing field. And what happens is government of Singapore, government in Taiwan, government in China. China offers sometimes 50% of the construction costs and higher. So how can a state with great intentions to try to attract a semiconductor manufacturing facility, how can a state ever compete with that? And there's a lot of other things like labor and you know, we, for rule of law and IP protection, we're fantastic, right? We're the best. But when it, and predictability of the business environment, we're the best. But when it comes to the kind of the hard money, we don't compete. And that's a delta that really needs to be closed. I don't want to suggest that no manufacturing growth has happened here at all. There's growth happening in your state, in New York. There's growth happening in Arizona. It is going on. It's just, you know, what's happening right now is there's a tremendous demand for semiconductors. There's an explosion of demand for semiconductors. How our economy is digitalizing, and now with COVID-19, how remote work, remote health care, this is all going to be supported by semiconductors. In the next 10 years, there's going to be an explosion of demand, and there's going to be an explosion of demand to build more semiconductor fabs. What we need to have in place so that New York and other states can fill the void there is we need to have federal incentives in place so that we can be a big part as a country in catching the next big wave of fab construction. And that's really what's at stake here.
Tell me a little bit about what's going on in Washington and some of the legislation that's moving around.
Yeah, so I must say it's challenging but very exciting times in this regard in Washington. You know, with you know, China has been a big part of our supply chain. We only manufacture in the single digits, the low single digits in China. Most of our manufacturing is done other places, but China is a big customer. There's a lot of supply chain that goes through China. But with the kind of souring of relations, economic and trade relations with China, combined with an increased awareness that we have some vulnerabilities in our supply chains, particularly when it comes to manufacturing semiconductors, and with COVID-19 putting into bold relief such vulnerabilities, not just of semiconductors, but of course medical supplies and other things. This is all kind of conspired to create an environment in Washington where lawmakers and officials in the administration are very much focused on addressing these problems when it comes to semiconductors. So
Because it has to do with our economy as well as our national security, correct?
combined, there's economic security, there's national security, and semiconductors are viewed as being absolutely critical to both of those. In a very short time period, we've had a significant momentum coming out of the administration to try to deal with this problem, but also a lot of activity on the Hill. There's been two major pieces of legislation submitted. One's called the CHIPS Act by Senator Cornyn and Senator Warner. And then there's the American Foundries Act, which is very similar in the Senate by Senator Cotton and your Senator Schumer. And around this is a lot of energy and a lot of other sponsors coming onto this. These bills have been merged and have, in a fashion, been incorporated into the legislation that needs to pass this year to fund our national security. It's called the NDAA, National Defense Authorization Act. And just last week, a version of these two bills was inserted in the last minute onto this huge piece of legislation. And now that's in the Senate side. And there's been parallel legislation submitted in the House, Congresswoman Matsui and Congressman McCall. And now the House is going to turn to working on the NDAA. And hopefully these things will come together later this year and we'll actually get an outcome that would provide significant funding to incentivize manufacturing. And we can talk about this a little bit more later because it's critical, but also significantly increase US government investments in semiconductor basic research. The bigger piece of it is that with research, with R&D, and actually John Kelly from IBM talks about this a lot, it creates a virtuous cycle. And if the federal government contributes to the R&D, and those R&D dollars almost all go into universities around the country, right? So you create programs for basic semiconductor research, and that creates opportunities for the talent to come to those programs, and it creates incubation for the talent and a magnet for the talent and a demand for the talent. That's one of the reasons why we're calling for, and we're happy to see this legislation calls for significant increases in funding for semiconductor R&D. Our industry itself, we contribute about 20% of our sales going back into R&D. That's right up there with the pharmaceutical industry as being the top 1 and 2 as far as research intensity of all industries. So stay ahead and to create these amazing chips that power our iPhones. The pace of innovation has to be awesome, and that costs a lot of money. We put a lot of money into the R&D, and the US government needs to put more in. Other governments have defined semiconductor research as a national priority, and ours has as well, but our funding for decades has been flat. Other governments have significantly increased their funding for semiconductor investments.
Speaking about things that cost a lot, can you cover the average cost of building a fab and why we've seen so much consolidation over the past 20, 30 years?
Right. Well, it's like building a house. You get very different kinds of houses for different kinds of prices because the industry is very different. We have the analog side of the industry, which builds chips that turns the real world into the digital world. We have the memory side of the industry that's kind of the library in your machines. And then you have the logic side of the industry, which is kind of the brains, does all the processing. For some of the analog, it can be a few $1 billion for a new fab. For a leading edge logic, it can be upwards of 25 billion, more than a modern aircraft carrier. So these are really massive costs involved. And like I said before, we're not dealing with a level playing field when it comes to the manufacturing side of this for the incentives. The central governments have been doing this for decades, and we have not. And the result is we've gone from producing about 40% of the world's chips to producing 12% of the world's chips.
Wow.
And if we stay on track, in 10 years, we'll be producing even 25% less than we are. We'll be down to roughly 10%, less than 10% of the world's chips. The key thing with China is that the Xi Jinping and the Chinese government have identified semiconductors as a national priority. And for the last 5 years, have been dumping huge amounts of central government money into their industry to build an indigenous industry. The numbers are a little hard to nail down, but between $100 and $150 billion have been earmarked. Much of that's spent already, and that doesn't compare at all. I mean, it's so far and above what anyone else has ever done in terms of trying to build out an indigenous industry, and it's all being led by the government. It has Xi Jinping himself has put a priority in. It has very high level attention. There's a lot of money behind it, and that's really, you know, what we worry about is we're fine with China building out an indigenous industry. We like having other competitors, but what makes us nervous is the size of the incentives are huge, and it could create the building with something like 60 fabs being built in China, built or already are going to be built in the short term, and that could create massive overcapacity, non-market driven overcapacity in our sector. We've seen that before. We know what it does, and it's not pretty. You get a flood of semiconductors on the global market, and it really cripples the industry.
So let's get back to some of the impending legislation right now in the Senate and the House.
Yeah.
Can you give me kind of a sense of what some of these packages look like and how that could potentially impact us in upstate New York?
Two big components. One of them is federal money to incentivize manufacturing, and you know, one of the CHIPS bill had roughly 10 billion for that. That's the Corn and Warner bill, and then the Cotton Schumer bill had roughly 20 billion. And then there's also money for R&D spending, and that range between 5 and 15 billion, depending on which bill you're looking at. Now those have been merged, and what's happened when they got merged and put into this defense spending bill is the funding levels got stripped out. It got too complicated to have the numbers in there, but the concepts were in that legislation to have you know, more incentives, have incentives for manufacturing, having federal government investments in R&D. Now this goes to the House, and we're going to try to get funding levels put back in so that when the two chambers come together, we'll have something that we hope approximates a package of maybe 30 billion between manufacturing incentives and R&D, between 20 and 30 billion for manufacturing incentives and R&D incentives.
Right, which could potentially be just a drop in the bucket, knowing that the average fab costs between 10 and 16 billion dollars.
That's true, but you know, I don't think we'll ever be able to compete with China, and actually that's not such a big problem because most of our companies have made the strategic decision not to have their fabs in China for various reasons. But you need to compete with Singapore, you need to compete with Taiwan and Israel, and believe it or not, Ireland. And so their incentives packages are maybe, you know, 20 or 30% of the cost of a fab and operating in the first few years. So you need to get closer to those numbers, and you know, if there's 15 billion or 20 billion of incentives out there, and you pass that around to a bunch of companies, you know, an extra 3 or 4 billion per fab makes a big difference.
Right. Well, and it makes a big difference for the state and the localities that have been really investing heavily to be in this game. So we saw just a few weeks ago, we saw TSMC, Taiwan Semiconductor,
Yeah.
announced that they wanted to build a fab in Arizona. Do you expect more good news like that to
Well,
come?
yeah, we hope that that coming out of this legislative effort, we hope to get, frankly, a number of announcements for more activity. Um, and I don't know why there wouldn't be. I think what's really holding companies back from doing more, there's, like I said, there's a fair amount done already, but I think there could really be a significant more amount more of construction here if there are federal incentives in place. And I think I know that's what the administration wants. I know that's what people on the Hill are thinking. And we certainly agree with that. If we can be successful in getting this legislation through, I think we'll see significantly more announcements to build fabs in the U.S.
That's fantastic. And what does the timing look like on this legislation
Yeah,
potential?
so there's a couple of things here. If we can get successfully included in the final defense package, we could have it and get the appropriations all taken care of by the end of the year. This would be for funding for next year, 2021. So it would become pretty quickly. And then there's the possibility of us being included in the next package of COVID-19 measures. And that could even come sooner if we are successful. We're probably going to go parallel tracks and go with this defense bill, but also with the COVID bill. And the rationale for that is that if we're going to be more resilient to pandemic-like emergencies, we have to fix some of our vulnerabilities in our semiconductor supply chains. And that's what this is really all about.
Right. And I think that, yeah, the COVID situation has really uncovered a lot of those vulnerabilities at many different levels. But we know that in Saratoga County, Global Foundries is considered an essential manufacturer. And not only is it essential, it is one of the safest places in the world to be, a clean room, correct?
So when this all started kind of unfolding in March, there was a lot of attention to trying to figure out which sectors were essential sectors and which weren't. And we were fortunately at the federal level and in pretty much all the states, we were designated as essential. The clean rooms are, I mean, it's the industry, which is incredibly disciplined, and we have amazingly disciplined protocols for keeping things clean. Was easy for us to make the case that not only were we essential, because without semiconductors being produced, kind of the economy would fall flat on its face, but also we're just amazingly well suited for dealing with a pandemic and keeping our environments safe and clean.
Well, John, thank you so much for your time today. We won't take any more. Look forward to an opportunity to potentially do this again, as we start to see more progress in Washington. And we really appreciate your time and your partnership.
Well, the sky's the limit, Shelby, on this. And I would love to be able to do this face-to-face at some point.
We look forward to that. And Saratoga welcomes you, and I'd be happy to give you a tour.
Thank you.